Pacific Heights is a 1990 thriller movie starring Melanie Griffith, Matthew Modine, and Michael Keaton. The story revolves around Patty Palmer, played by Melanie Griffith, and her boyfriend, Drake Goodman, played by Matthew Modine. Patty and Drake are a young and ambitious couple living in San Francisco in the late 20th century. They're seeking to build a life together, but also to achieve the American dream, which is no longer just a house in the suburbs and a white picket fence. For the modern era, it means owning a home and having other people pay for it. They're landlords. The heroes of our story are landlords.
I don't even think you can get approved for the loan at your income level.
We'll fudge the numbers a little.
Yeah, everybody does it. It's expected.
But it's also very illegal. Look, I'm not going to go to bat for banks here. My early 20s were defined by the 2007-2008 subprime mortgage crisis. The entire financial system robbed my generation of any sense of comfort or stability, let alone something as lofty of a concept as home ownership. And still to this day, no one's really been held to account for all of that. I'm not saying it's okay to lie to banks, but I'm not against it.
Between my savings and Drake's, we can cover the down payment. And the realtor said that we could get one of those home equity loans for improvements.
Pass. It's too risky a call. I mean, if someone misses 1 month's rent, you're going to go down like the Titanic.
And just to address any potential scolding about financial responsibility, personal accountability, or whatever weird thought-terminating cliche or aphorism you may be programmed to spout out, the financial crisis of 2007 and '08 was not a matter of simply people getting loans they couldn't pay back. It was brokers and other financial entities getting paid to generate those loans through things like origination fees. Then they would take all those loans and bundle them all together in something called a collateralized debt obligation, a CDO. This was created specifically to disguise the risk of all those loans, and it was a way for them to get even more money by selling those as instruments to investors. It was a predatory and deceptive practice that was not only deeply rewarding, but it lacked any real consequence for the people making the most money from it. And this will always be a problem when we commodify a human need such as housing. While I'm not particularly concerned with the morality of lying to banks, this does expose Patty and Drake as hypocrites for expecting honesty from rental applicants, a courtesy they deny to their own mortgage lender. They fret constantly about the creditworthiness of potential renters, the people they need to afford their house.
Credit and references all checked out, so we'll have to check your credit.
Yeah, it's a credit history, that sort of thing.
So now if you're following along, the heroes of the story are liars, landlords, and now hypocrites. Oh, yeah, and one more thing.
Where's his application? Maybe he's one of those minority scam artists. Some of these people can be pretty shrewd, Patty. It's not a racial thing, it's just common sense.
That's what a racist would say. Before anyone says, but Drake and Patty have a black friend. Maybe. The character of Dennis, played by Dorian Harewood, does appear familiar with the couple. However, his role in their lives is less defined. He seems to act more like a trusted advisor than a personal friend. Hell, he doesn't even appear at the ceremonial whatever this is when Patty and Drake actually get the home. Knowing a single black person, or even several black people, and being friendly with them, it doesn't negate the reflexive responses conditioned into us by a society that was clearly built to favor someone for being born one way over the other. It does require a lot to undo and unlearn. It takes a lot of conscious effort, so I can understand that at times it can be discouraging, and it's just sometimes feels easier to maybe ignore it. I don't need to get into all that here, but yeah, it was the late 80s and early 90s. Casual racism just sort of lingered in the air. Here's just a small example of that in this movie. I think it's important to sort of lay this foundation so that we can understand that in this particular time and place that a lying, hypocritical, yuppie landlord couple who may be a bit racist can be portrayed as sympathetic, if not heroic. It is a reflection of the era. Patty and Drake are, after all, baby boomers in a movie which the target audience, at least upon the release of this film, would have been fellow baby boomers. The virtue is taken as read, and it's unquestioned. On the other hand, the antagonist of the film, Hayes Carter, played by Michael Keaton, he shares a lot of the same flaws as Patty and Drake. However, these flaws are portrayed as distorted amplifications, with the exception of casual racism, which I will give him points for. Like Patty and Drake, he too is a dishonest person, and that dishonesty has also led to his financial situation being every bit as precarious. Make no mistake, Hayes is not a good person. This isn't some attempt to recast him as some victim of society or some plucky underdog. He isn't portrayed with the same degree of complexity as Patty and Drake, which, in a movie like this, kind of says a lot. His motivations are on par with that of a cartoon villain. He just wants to take down a score and move on to the next mark. There's no real humanity to him because he is not a fully formed character. He is just a stand-in for all the anxieties and fears of the average American landlord. The film is actually quite explicit with this message.
Listen to me. Listen.
I just want the guy the hell out of my house.
Well, then you better listen to me, or he's going to be so far up your butt, you're going to be picking him out your nose. Now, I want you to turn back on all the heat and all the power to this man's apartment. You apologize, and you do not, and I emphasize, do not, harass him again. Then go out and get yourself a lawyer. Because according to California Civil Code, Mr. Hayes can sue you for this stunt you just pulled. And most likely he'll win.
More like California, am I right?
The net effect of these laws is to protect any pointy-headed cretin who moves
Slam.
into your property and slowly drives you bankrupt and insane.
So now you know the main conflict of the story. I could use this moment to talk about something like squatters' rights and adverse possession laws in the United States and how they're directly informed by things like manifest destiny and westward expansion, and how it gave legitimacy to American settlers to dispossess and displace the indigenous peoples, as well as expanding slavery. I know that as I'm making this, there's a push in conservative circles to create a media hysteria about squatters, but I guess for now the most I will say is creating a nation on stolen land is just bad karma. I know we can't change what has happened, but we can change how the echoes of history resonate. Anyway, I guess we should just start talking about this movie, right? So, how does Hayes even get into the Drake and Palmer household to begin with? Because Hayes Carter is just a projection of every landlord's fears and, by extension, the fears of the upper middle and upper classes, his methods are left rather vague. We're not sure how he does it, but we just know that he has some sense of how to utilize publicly available data and the intricacies of various bureaucracies to find and target victims. And I'll just say that the upfront cost and legwork alone to even perpetrate these schemes is actually kind of commendable, especially before the wide adoption of the internet and by the general public. He would literally have to drive to various locations around the state of California, fill out paperwork, wait days by a mailbox or even a fax machine. There are probably some fees related to processing. It's just a lot of work. In any case, it seems as though Hayes Carter just compiles real estate listings and then drives to those locations hoping to find a mark. It's on one of these scouting trips that he comes across Patty and Drake's home, and wow. $749,000 is still a lot of money today, and it was even more back then. Around that time, the average home in San Francisco cost around $300,000, and today, that $749,000 is worth around $1.8 million, so not exactly a typical starter home. Or, let's be honest, just a typical home in general. Moving on, while Hayes does have an initial meeting with Drake Goodman about the apartment, his actual attempts at conning Drake are not exactly successful. He pulls up in a Porsche, flashes cash, and he talks about his busy go-go lifestyle in his businessman costume. Yet, it is only through sheer unbridled confidence and one very major coincidence that even allows Drake to occupy the apartment. But once he's in, and the law is the law, at least according to this movie.
If he's in, he's got rights. That's how it works.
I don't think squatters' rights cover merely entering an occupied building without a prior agreement with the owner, but I don't know. But Bear in mind the time that this was made and the audience that it was meant to appeal to. Reagan was still president while this movie was being made. Every other movie of this era, if it had a hint of violence or crime, it had some sort of critique of the American justice system. And frankly, it was always that it wasn't harsh enough. And thus, the only natural conclusion of this was that, as an American, one had to take justice into their own hands. Well, at least that attitude doesn't persist today in the United States. Don't get me wrong, there are definitely problems with the American justice system, but it has nothing to do with it being less harsh or less authoritarian. So, now that Hayes has successfully embedded himself in the Palmer/Goodman household, the situation deteriorates immediately in an almost comedic doom spiral. The passage of time is unclear throughout this movie, but it feels like Hayes becomes a general nuisance almost overnight. The noise from his apartment keeps everyone in the building awake, and he has even brought in a new roommate to help him become even more insufferable to his neighbors. We find out later he is stripping the apartment of all its appliances, wiring, flooring, and even its plumbing. Again, this is cartoon villain nonsense. I just think it's important to note that neither Hayes nor his partner ever leave the apartment, so it's unclear to me how they sustain themselves or prevent themselves from getting bored or, just occupying their day. It's also because Hayes actually starts breeding cockroaches later into the movie so he can drive out the other tenants, and it's unclear to me how he even does that. But again, the way these characters are written, it seems like they're just kind of like an embodiment of fears of a particular class of Americans, and as such, they just aren't human and don't need human things. Once Hayes' initial campaign of fear and harassment is complete, he moves to the second phase of his dastardly plan, and that is to use the legal system and California's unjust state housing laws against our hero landlords, Drake and Patty. In the throes of frustration one night, Drake turns off the utilities to the apartment. This is a huge legal no-no. It's not really a way to deal with the tenant, though I kind of don't understand if they have a legitimate agreement. I'm not a lawyer, so if there's any lawyers out there that are hearing this and understand the intricacies of state housing laws in California, preferably before 1990, let me know. Anyway, this prompts a civil lawsuit from Hayes in which the judge does rule in his favor, and the judge even orders Patty and Drake to reduce the rent. Though at this point, Hayes has never given Patty nor Drake a single cent. He does state that he signed a lease earlier in the movie, and by all appearances in the court scene, he does in fact have one, which I don't understand how. Maybe early on, he somehow tricked Patty or Drake into having him sign one without ever putting money down, or it's a fraudulent document and the court just accepted it. But given Hayes' skill set, it's likely that it's a forgery. However, Patty and Drake don't ever seem to contest this in court, so again, it's a mystery. Due to the added stress, Patty has a miscarriage, and it is mentioned earlier in the movie that she's pregnant. However, it's not really given any weight, it's actually quite understated. Patty herself actually makes a remark that she may not even keep it. But I suppose this is just to illustrate that they're a young, hip, modern San Francisco couple. And in the very beginning of the movie, there is a point that they make that they are living together and not married, which would have been a big deal back then. Hell, even in my 20s, it was still considered kind of a big deal. This was the early 2000s, and my girlfriend at the time and I were denied an apartment specifically because we weren't married. The landlord that was showing us the apartment said right to our faces she just didn't feel comfortable renting to a couple that wasn't married. She thought it was a sin. The miscarriage provides an opportunity for Hayes to needle the couple even further and push them closer and closer to the edge. He's trying to elicit a reaction. Unbeknownst to the couple, this is his plan, and Drake falls directly into the trap, responding violently. Hayes uses this as a basis to file a temporary restraining order and also to file a civil suit. He somehow managed to pre-plan all this and call the cops ahead of time. It's a movie. What are you gonna do? One of the main themes of this movie is just the impotency of the justice system and how it can be used against quote-unquote good people like Patty and Drake. Patty and Drake's lawyer, Stephanie McDonald, is played by Laurie Metcalf and is used by the writer of the movie to air any grievances and resentments that the writer may have about the current state of the American legal system.
This isn't a moral question, Patricia. Morally, you're right. You win. Big deal.
The character isn't very subtle. She's written specifically as a lawyer so she can make scathing rebukes of the American justice system from a position of authority. As stated earlier, this movie does all it can to make sure that the audience sympathizes with the plight of the yuppie landlords. To do this, the writer goes the extra mile to make sure that Hayes lacks any potential to become even remotely relatable. Hayes is the opposite side of the coin of our dear heroes, and I guess this is the part where I mentioned his name isn't even Hayes. Hayes is just an identity he has stolen from his last mark. We find out later his real name is James Danforth, and he grew up wealthy, but he was disinherited from his family's fortune for being evil, I guess. It's lazy, but it aligns perfectly with the worldview of the target audience and the attitudes of the era. There are no systemic causes nor intersection of opposing interests that can explain the conflict. It's just good versus evil, which is, for better or worse, an attitude boomers and conservatives of all ages use to interpret the world today. Hayes' MO is murky, but he manages to win properties and civil suits after squatting in them, but he also assumes the identity of the people he has just won the property from in court. I don't know or even understand the ID theft portion of the con. However, fake identities are a trope of thrillers, and I assume per some WGA bylaw that this detail had to be shoehorned into the script in order to successfully qualify for studio funding or something. I don't know. In addition, James/Hayes, he was raised in great comfort, and if not just luxury. It's worthy to note this because he's not from the wrong side of the tracks, and he isn't going through life with a giant chip on his shoulder because of that. And I believe this is just intentional on the writer's part because it falls into that conservative ideal, that ideal of rugged individualism from the Reagan era, that James has no one to blame for his life other than himself. And that's what makes James/Hayes the perfect villain. Not perfect in the sense that there's something compelling about him that must be studied and replicated for generations to come. Rather perfect like he was designed to fit into the perfect recesses of the affluent baby boomer brain that fears a loss of passive income. In that sense, he's perfectly crafted. And so when Hayes/James is finally defeated, the audience can feel nothing but relief, if not complete joy. Although some of that might be just due to the fact that this means the movie is almost over. And yes, Hayes/James does die in the end. How it comes to pass is not terribly interesting, and there are a few points of the plot that I'm just going to skip entirely because they don't really serve the film. For instance, I mentioned Hayes' fake identity. Since we can't even identify with him on a human level, it's not really a great reveal that he isn't the person he introduced himself as. And so what? I mean, if he isn't the person he said he was, that doesn't really change anything, really, in terms of character. I mean, as Hayes, he was a bad person. As James, he's still a bad person. There isn't really a delineation in character there. I guess the one thing I'll discuss is that Hayes/James is killed in the very same apartment he had stripped for parts. After having been outed by Patty for impersonating Drake Goodman in a hotel, Hayes/James/now fake Drake Goodman is arrested. He manages to make bail due to the largesse of an older rich widow that he has been conning as Drake Goodman. After making bail, James uses the opportunity to confront Patty and Drake in their home. It doesn't go his way. James ends up impaled on a pipe, debris created in the aftermath of his plundering. However, it does play into the theme that James is responsible, and therefore every criminal, universally, is responsible for every circumstance in their lives, from the first breath to the last. However, the true moral of the story is shown in the final scene. It's simply not enough for Patty and Drake to have faced evil head-on and conquered it. One would think that such a harrowing ordeal would offer profound lessons about this life and what matters in it. But no. The true moral of the story is that they can finally finish renovating the property and then sell it to an even richer couple for a staggering return on investment. Thus, showing the very first moments that will doom San Francisco and the Bay Area into the housing affordability crisis we see today that has, frankly, infected the rest of the nation. And that, for me, is what makes this movie interesting. This movie was released in 1990, and there certainly was no intention to predict the future or even comment on it. It's a popcorn movie meant to appeal to the average expectations of a mainstream audience, and yet it somehow managed to highlight the beginnings of a horrible crisis. It's just a strange accident of history, and one I find fascinating. Well, that's it. That's the movie. That's how it goes, for the most part. I might have skipped some things, but in essence, you have all the beats, all the main points. Well, I guess I'm supposed to say something like and subscribe, but I don't even know if this thing will ever get traction. I guess that helps, but, I'm not expecting much, I suppose. In either case, I actually did have a lot of fun doing this. It took several hours. I know it's pretty shoddy, but this did take a lot of time of my life, but in a good way. Bye.